The 69th Mob versus the Family Gang War in California. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the streets of Oakland, California, became the stage for one of the bloodiest gang wars in American history. At the center of the conflict were two powerful heroin organizations. The 69 Mob, led by the rising kingpin Felix, the Cat Mitchell, and their fierce rivals, the Family, commanded by the equally ambitious Mickey Mo Moore. Oakland, with its high-density housing projects and long-standing economic struggles, had become a fertile ground for heroin distribution. The city's ports and highways made it a strategic hub for drug trafficking in Northern California. But by 1980, only one question mattered on the streets: who would control Oakland's heroin empire? Felix Mitchell was young, sharp, and ruthless. From his base on 69th Avenue, he built the 69th Mob into an organization that mirrored the structure of the Italian mafia. Soldiers handled corners, lieutenants controlled shipments, and Felix sat at the top, drawing in millions of dollars each year. For many in East Oakland, he was both a villain and a benefactor, feared by rivals, but admired in the neighborhood for the wealth and opportunities he brought. Standing in his way was Mickey Moore and his outfit known simply as the Family. They were every bit as violent, disciplined, and ambitious as the mob. Their claim to Oakland's heroin market set the stage for an inevitable collision. By the summer of 1980, that collision exploded into all-out war. Newspapers reported 6 gangland murders in 3 days, a pace of violence that stunned even seasoned law enforcement. Victims were gunned down in cars, shot in the streets, and left as bloody warnings for whoever dared cross enemy lines. For ordinary Oakland residents, daily life became a nightmare. Innocent bystanders were caught in crossfire, and fear kept many families behind locked doors once the sun went down. Detectives described it as a drug war with no rules. Each murder led to a retaliation, and each retaliation spiraled into another round of killings. The mob and the Family stalked one another with military precision, hunting their rivals across Oakland. As the body count mounted, the federal government took notice. The war between the 69th Mob and the Family coincided with the nationwide escalation of the war on drugs. Federal prosecutors began building cases, tapping phones, and tracking the flow of heroin from Oakland back to international suppliers. But even as indictments loomed, the bloodshed did not stop. Felix Mitchell proved especially resilient. Despite law enforcement pressure, his organization expanded, dwarfing the Family and controlling a vast share of Oakland's heroin trade. Witnesses who might testify against him disappeared or stayed silent, terrified of mob retaliation. The Family, meanwhile, absorbed crushing losses. Though Mickey Moore's crew remained dangerous, the endless wave of mob soldiers overwhelmed their ability to hold territory. The heroin corners, once claimed by the Family, slowly fell under 69 mob control. By the early 1980s, it was clear that Felix Mitchell's empire had triumphed. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The violence left scars across Oakland. Entire families lost loved ones. Children grew up amid funerals, gunshots, and the intimidating presence of street soldiers on every block. Community leaders begged for peace, but the war had already redefined the city's underworld. In 1981, authorities intensified their crackdown. Mitchell was arrested that December, facing charges tied to drug distribution and suspicions of murder for hire. The Family, weakened and bloodied, also came under heavy legal fire. Yet even as the leaders faced indictments, the legend of their war lived on. The 69th Mob versus the Family Gang War was more than a clash over drugs. It was a battle for power, money, and reputation in a city caught in the cross-currents of poverty and criminal opportunity. The war helped cement Oakland's reputation as a key front in America's drug crisis, and it laid the foundation for the ongoing struggles that would shape East Oakland for decades to come. Felix Mitchell's eventual downfall, his 1986 conviction, and subsequent murder in prison did not erase his legacy, nor did Mickey Moore's decline erase the family's reputation. Their war became the stuff of street lore, whispered about in Oakland for generations. This was not just a gang rivalry. It was a ruthless war for survival, fought block by block, body by body, until one side stood victorious. The echoes of that war still haunt Oakland today, a reminder of the deadly price paid when power, ambition, and violence collide. The 69th Mob versus Funktown, USA gang war in California. In the turbulent streets of East Oakland during the late 1970s and early 1980s, a deadly rivalry erupted that would define a generation of drug wars. On one side stood the 69 Mob, led by the ambitious heroin kingpin Felix the Cat Mitchell. On the other, a rising neighborhood crew known as Funktown USA determined to carve out its own empire. Their war for Oakland's heroin trade would drench the city in blood, transforming local turf disputes into national headlines. Felix Mitchell was unlike any street hustler before him. From his base near 69th Avenue, he structured his organization with a level of discipline and hierarchy that mirrored organized crime syndicates. With lieutenants, enforcers, and soldiers spread across Oakland, the 69 Mob controlled a heroin pipeline that brought in millions of dollars annually. Mitchell himself became a figure of both fear and fascination, admired in his neighborhood for bringing money and jobs, while simultaneously blamed for fueling addiction and violence. But in East Oakland, the drug trade was never a one-man show. Funktown USA, a younger and aggressive crew based out of the area near 35th Avenue and Brookdale, was determined to challenge the mob's dominance. Their name became synonymous with flash, defiance, and the willingness to shed blood to stake their claim. Unlike the family, Mitchell's other rival, led by Mickey Moore, Funktown's conflict with the 69 Mob was fueled not only by business, but also by neighborhood pride and street-level animosity. The first sparks of war ignited as Funktown crews began undercutting 69 mob dealers on heroin corners. For Mitchell, whose empire thrived on complete control, this was intolerable. Shooting soon followed. By the early 1980s, Oakland police began noting a sharp uptick in homicides linked to battles between the mob and Funktown. Each side deployed hitmen to eliminate rivals, and the city's neighborhoods became divided between those loyal to 69th Avenue and those aligned with Funktown. This was not a war fought quietly. Gunfire became routine in East Oakland. Funerals stacked up week after week, and residents learned to recognize the sound of automatic weapons echoing through the night. For children growing up in the community, it was a constant reminder that the streets belonged to men with money, drugs, and guns. Law enforcement, meanwhile, struggled to keep up. Oakland detectives and federal agents tracked the escalating bloodshed, but witnesses refused to testify, fearing retaliation. Both the mob and Funktown operated with a code of silence. In a city already wary of police, cooperation was rare. As the 69th Mob continued to expand, Funktown doubled down. Their leaders believed that Mitchell's growing fame and the media portrayal of him as Oakland's heroin czar was a weakness. If they could keep striking, they could destabilize his empire. But Felix was always a step ahead. His organization's size, resources, and connections dwarfed Funktown's. For every corner Funktown tried to take, the mob retaliated with overwhelming force. The human toll was staggering. Innocent residents often paid the price, caught in crossfire or targeted by mistake. Mothers buried sons, neighborhoods emptied at night, and the sense of community frayed under the constant threat of violence. The war became part of daily life, an unending cycle of revenge. By 1985, the balance of power was clear. Felix Mitchell's '69 mob had largely broken Funktown's ability to compete on the same scale. The mob controlled the bulk of Oakland's heroin trade, while Funktown was pushed into smaller, scattered operations. Yet even in decline, Funktown's reputation endured. They had stood toe-to-toe with one of the most powerful drug organizations in California history, and survived, at least in fragments. When Felix Mitchell was arrested in 1985 and later murdered in prison in 1986, the landscape of Oakland's drug world shifted once again. Without his leadership, the '69 mob fractured, opening opportunities for old rivals and new crews alike. Funktown, though weakened, continued to exist as a neighborhood identity, and its legacy as one of the few gangs bold enough to openly challenge Felix Mitchell remained embedded in Oakland's street lore. The 69th Mob versus Funktown USA War was not just about money, it was about respect, territory, and the brutal logic of survival in East Oakland. It left a trail of bodies, reshaped the city's underworld, and foreshadowed the gang and drug wars that would sweep across California in the decades to come. Today, the echoes of that conflict still linger. For Oakland, it was more than just another gang war. It was a turning point, a violent struggle that revealed how ambition and rivalry could consume entire neighborhoods. In the end, the story of '69 Mob versus Funktown USA is a stark reminder of the human cost of power on the streets. The '69th Mob's post-Felix Mitchell succession violence. When Felix the Cat Mitchell, Oakland's infamous heroin kingpin, was stabbed to death in federal prison in 1986, it sent shockwaves through California's underworld. For nearly a decade, Mitchell's '69 mob had reigned supreme in East Oakland, building one of the most profitable heroin empires west of the Mississippi. His funeral, a lavish procession with a horse-drawn carriage and thousands in attendance, showed just how deeply his name was woven into the community. But behind the spectacle lay a dangerous truth. With Felix gone, the '69 mob was suddenly leaderless. And on the streets, a new war for power had just begun. Felix Mitchell had been more than a drug boss. He was the glue that held a sprawling organization together. He kept rival lieutenants in check, negotiated truces, and enforced discipline through fear and loyalty. Without him, the mob fractured. Ambitious lieutenants and younger soldiers saw an opportunity to carve out their own territories. Rivals who had once been forced into submission by Felix's empire now saw an opening to reclaim Oakland's corners. The balance of power was gone, replaced by chaos and violence. By 1987, Oakland's homicide rate began to climb sharply. Detectives attributed much of the surge to the succession wars following Mitchell's death. Former allies turned into enemies overnight. Mob factions splintered into smaller crews, each demanding control over heroin blocks that Felix once governed with an iron hand. Shootouts erupted at street corners, nightclubs, and apartment complexes. The old East Oakland turf map was redrawn in blood. Law enforcement, already burdened by the crack cocaine epidemic sweeping California, struggled to keep pace. Federal officials admitted that while they had succeeded in eliminating Felix Mitchell, they had inadvertently created a power vacuum that unleashed even more violence. What had once been one centralized empire became a fractured battlefield of competing gangs. Community members described the late 1980s as a time when Oakland felt like a war zone. The murder rate climbed and gunfire echoed nightly in neighborhoods once dominated by Mitchell's order. Where Felix had offered a degree of stability, however brutal, his absence left nothing but chaos. The succession violence also drew in old enemies. Crews connected to the family, Felix's former rivals under Mickey Moore, tried to reassert themselves. Remnants of Funktown, USA sought to rebuild their presence. New players tied to the emerging crack trade added even more volatility. The once unified 69 mob was now just one competitor among many in Oakland's bloody drug wars. For the young soldiers who had once followed Felix's lead, the late 1980s were about survival. Many of them lacked Mitchell's organizational skills and long-term vision. Instead, their rule was dictated by immediate violence. Turf was taken not through negotiation, but through drive-by shootings and ambushes. The cycle of retaliation seemed endless. Federal authorities responded with sweeping indictments. Undercover operations targeted the splintered mob factions and their rivals. By the end of the decade, dozens of former 69 mob members were behind bars. Yet even prison did not bring peace. The violence carried over into California's penitentiaries, where old alliances and grudges continued to fuel attacks behind bars. For Oakland's communities, the damage was devastating. Families who had once looked to Felix Mitchell, paradoxically, both as a villain and a neighborhood benefactor, now lived under constant fear. There was no single figure to broker peace or keep violence contained. Instead, children grew up amid nightly shootings, and funerals became a common ritual. The post-Felix succession violence of the late 1980s underscored a central truth about organized crime. When a powerful leader falls, the struggle to replace him can be more destructive than his reign. Mitchell's empire, for all its brutality, had at least maintained a hierarchy. In its absence, Oakland endured years of bloodshed. By the early 1990s, much of the original 69 mob was gone, either dead, imprisoned, or absorbed into other organizations. But the legacy of Felix Mitchell and the chaos that followed his death continued to haunt Oakland. His rise had proven how far a single man could take a neighborhood crew. His fall had shown how quickly that empire could collapse into violence when the leader was gone. The story of the 69th Mob's succession wars is not just about Oakland. It is about what happens in cities across America when drug empires fracture. The late 1980s were a lesson in unintended consequences. Removing one kingpin does not end the violence. It often multiplies it. Felix Mitchell's death closed one chapter of Oakland's gang history, but it opened another, one written in blood by the men who tried and failed to fill his shoes. The 69th Avenue Village versus 65th Avenue Village gang war. In the early 2000s, a new chapter in Oakland's violent gang history unfolded. Long after the fall of Felix Mitchell's infamous 69 mob, the neighborhoods he once ruled were still scarred by drugs, poverty, and violence. Out of these streets emerged two rival factions, the 69th Avenue Village and the 65th Avenue Village. Their feud would ignite one of the city's deadliest modern gang wars, claiming lives and leaving entire communities trapped in fear. The 69th Avenue Village, rooted in East Oakland near the legacy territory of Mitchell's old 69 mob, was more than just a neighborhood crew. It carried the name of an area that had long been synonymous with power in Oakland's underworld. Across just a few blocks stood their bitter enemies, the 65th Avenue Village, a younger but equally violent gang. What began as territorial disputes over drug corners and neighborhood pride soon spiraled into a decade-long cycle of bloodshed. The war between the two villages was emblematic of a new era of Oakland gang violence. By the 2000s, the heroin empires of the 1980s had given way to smaller, decentralized sets. Crack cocaine and later marijuana trafficking, along with robberies and extortion, became the primary revenue streams. Unlike the structured hierarchy of Felix Mitchell's '69 mob, these groups were looser, younger, and often more reckless. That recklessness translated directly into violence. Drive-by shootings became the weapon of choice. Gunmen armed with assault rifles and handguns roamed the avenues, seeking out rivals on sight. In many cases, the feud blurred into personal vendettas. A brother killed in one shooting led to a cousin seeking revenge in another. The line between gang war and family feud disappeared, replaced by an endless cycle of retaliation. By the mid-2000s, Oakland's homicide rate soared, and detectives pointed directly to the 65th and 69th Avenue villages as key drivers of the violence. Entire city blocks became battlegrounds. Witnesses refused to come forward, terrified of reprisals. Families packed funerals every month, grieving teenagers who had barely reached adulthood. For ordinary residents, the sound of gunfire became as common as passing cars. The Oakland Police Department and federal authorities began targeting both sides. Wiretaps, undercover operations, and large-scale sweeps tried to dismantle the villages. But for every arrest, another young recruit stepped up, armed and eager to prove himself. Law enforcement described it as fighting a hydra. Cut off one head, and two more appeared. One of the bloodiest years came in the late 2000s, when a string of retaliatory killings left multiple young men dead in a matter of weeks. Each side released rap videos boasting of their firepower and mocking their rivals' dead, fueling the violence even further. Social media, a new battlefield of the 2010s, escalated the war beyond the streets, turning insults into gunfire within hours. In 2014 and 2015, state and federal task forces launched Operation Ceasefire and other initiatives, rounding up dozens of suspected members from both the 65th and 69th Avenue villages. Prosecutors unveiled indictments tying them to murders, drug trafficking, and weapons charges. Officials called the crackdown one of the largest anti-gang operations in Oakland's history. For the first time, it seemed the cycle of bloodshed might be slowing. But even with leadership removed, the feud left scars. Families who had lived on 65th and 69th Avenues for generations were displaced, driven out by fear or exhaustion. Children grew up in the shadow of violence, learning to recognize gunshots before they could recite multiplication tables. The war between the villages was more than just numbers on a homicide report. It was a human tragedy that reshaped East Oakland. By the late 2000s and 10s, the intensity of the feud began to wane under relentless law enforcement pressure and community intervention. Yet the memory of the war remains fresh. The village's conflict became a symbol of Oakland's broader struggle. How cycles of poverty, drugs, and revenge could trap neighborhoods in violence for decades. The 69th Avenue Village versus 65th Avenue Village gang war was not as nationally known as the reign of Felix Mitchell or the earlier heroin empires. But for those who lived through it, it was every bit as destructive. It showed that even in a new century, the streets of Oakland were still haunted by the same forces that had defined its past: territory, pride, and the relentless pursuit of power. In the end, the war left behind no true winners. Both villages lost generations of young men to death or prison. '69 mob legacy versus other Oakland crews in the 1980s to 1990s. In Oakland, California, the shadow of the '69 mob stretched long after the death of its founder, Felix the Cat Mitchell, in 1986. Mitchell's empire had transformed heroin trafficking in Northern California, bringing the organizational discipline of a cartel into the heart of East Oakland. But when he was murdered in federal prison, the empire he built fractured. What followed was not peace, but a new era of conflict, one in which the legacy of the '69 mob collided with a new wave of Oakland crews hungry for power. The late 1980s marked the beginning of this turbulent period. With Mitchell gone, lieutenants and younger soldiers scrambled to hold on to pieces of his once mighty heroin network. But without his leadership, the mob could no longer maintain its grip on Oakland's drug economy. Rivals who had been forced underground during Felix's reign suddenly saw opportunities. Crews connected to the family, to Funktown, USA, and to upstart neighborhood gangs all began moving onto corners once controlled by the '69 mob. This fragmentation of power turned Oakland into a patchwork of competing crews. Some factions still claimed loyalty to the mob name, but many operated independently, using the 69th Avenue identity as a banner of legitimacy. The result was a bloody contest for territory. The timing could not have been worse. The crack cocaine epidemic was sweeping through California, radically transforming the drug trade. Where Felix Mitchell had built his empire on heroin distribution, the new generation turned to crack, cheap, addictive, and devastatingly profitable. Suddenly, every block became a potential marketplace, and every crew was willing to kill to defend it. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Oakland's homicide rate soared. Much of the violence was tied directly to disputes involving remnants of the '69 mob and rival neighborhood crews. Drive-by shootings became common, and the body count rose year after year. Law enforcement officials often described the city as a war zone, where gang rivalries made survival uncertain for anyone caught in the crossfire. The '69th mob's legacy gave its members an aura of power, but it also made them a target. Rival gangs measured their reputation by how they stood against the mob name. For some, killing a '69 affiliate was a mark of credibility. This dynamic fueled a cycle of retaliation that seemed to have no end. At the same time, the mob's influence stretched beyond the streets. Inside California's prisons, former '69 mob affiliates carried their reputations with them. There, they collided with members of the Mexican Mafia, the Aryan Brotherhood, and Black Guerrilla family, adding prison politics to an already volatile situation. The battles fought behind bars often spilled back onto the streets of Oakland, with alliances and feuds shaping the city's drug corners. By the early 1990s, Oakland police and federal agencies launched sweeping operations to curb the violence. Wiretaps, undercover buys, and large-scale raids led to dozens of arrests. Yet each time a crew was dismantled, another seemed to take its place. The decentralized nature of Oakland's gangs meant there was no single kingpin to remove, no empire to topple in one strike. Instead, the city faced a constantly shifting battlefield. Meanwhile, the community bore the brunt of the war. Families were torn apart by addiction and gunfire. Mothers buried sons. Schools became recruitment grounds with teenagers drawn into gangs, carrying the legacy of the '69 mob. For many young men growing up in East Oakland, joining a crew tied to that legacy was less about choice and more about survival. The 69th mob versus other Oakland crews throughout the 1980s and 1990s symbolized a deeper struggle within the city, a struggle born from poverty, systemic neglect, and the lure of fast money. Felix Mitchell's death had created a void, and instead of bringing stability, it unleashed chaos. By the end of the 1990s, Oakland's gang landscape had changed dramatically. The original '69 mob was gone, its leaders dead or imprisoned. But its name lived on in the identities of new crews, in the stories whispered on the streets, and in the reputation Oakland carried as one of America's most violent cities during that era. The wars fought between the mob's remnants, and their rivals left a legacy not of wealth or power, but of bloodshed and broken communities. The story of the '69 mob legacy against other Oakland gangs is not just about criminal rivalry. It is about the ripple effects of one man's empire and how its collapse reshaped a city for decades. The 1980s and 1990s were Oakland's long reckoning with the ghost of Felix Mitchell. And in that reckoning, the city learned a bitter lesson. When a criminal dynasty falls, the violence does not end. Instead, it multiplies.